The Gulf War didn't start the way your history teacher told you. What if I told you the whole thing was a trap set decades before the first bomb dropped? August 2nd, 1990. Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait. The world watched in shock, but this wasn't sudden. This wasn't random. And Saddam Hussein, he thought he had permission. See, the Gulf War was the result of lies, debt, oil, and a handshake that never happened. And by the time Saddam realized what was really going on, it was already too late. To understand how this war really started, we need to go back 8 years earlier, to another war, one that left Iraq completely broken. In 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. He thought it would be quick, a few weeks, maybe a couple months. He'd grab some oil fields, expand his territory, and go home a hero. But Iran fought back, hard. What was supposed to be a short conflict turned into 8 years of brutal, bloody warfare, trench warfare, chemical weapons, hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. It was one of the longest and deadliest wars of the 20th century. By 1988, when the war finally ended, Iraq was in ruins. The economy was destroyed. The military was exhausted. And worst of all, Iraq owed over $80 billion in debt. Most of that money was borrowed from neighboring Arab countries, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. These countries had funded Iraq's war effort because they were terrified of Iran spreading its revolution across the region. So they gave Saddam money, weapons, support. They wanted him to fight Iran so they wouldn't have to. But now the war was over, and Kuwait wanted its money back. Here's where things get messy. Saddam didn't think he should have to pay Kuwait back. In his mind, he had just fought an 8-year war to protect the entire Arab world from Iran. He saw himself as the defender of the Gulf. So why should he owe anyone anything? He believed Kuwait should forgive the debt, or at least give him time. But Kuwait didn't see it that way. They wanted their money, and they started doing something that made Saddam furious. They started pumping oil, a lot of oil, way more than they were supposed to under OPEC agreements. See, OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They set limits on how much oil each member nation can produce to keep prices stable, but Kuwait was breaking those limits. They were flooding the market with cheap oil. And that was a huge problem for Iraq, because Iraq's entire economy depended on oil exports. They needed high oil prices to rebuild their country and pay off their debt. But with Kuwait overproducing, oil prices dropped. Every dollar the price fell cost Iraq billions in revenue. Saddam accused Kuwait of economic warfare. He claimed they were deliberately trying to destroy Iraq's economy, and he may have been right. But there's more. Saddam also accused Kuwait of something even worse. He said they were slant drilling. That means drilling at an angle into Iraqi oil fields from across the border, basically stealing Iraq's oil. Kuwait denied it, but Saddam didn't believe them. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and desperate. Iraq was drowning in debt. The people were suffering. Inflation was out of control. Unemployment was high. Saddam's grip on power was slipping. He needed a solution, fast. And that's when he started looking at Kuwait differently. Not as a neighbor, not as an ally, but as a solution. Kuwait is small. It's rich. It has some of the largest oil reserves in the world. And historically, Iraq had always claimed that Kuwait was part of Iraqi territory. The borders were drawn by the British after World War I, and Saddam argued they were never legitimate. In his mind, taking Kuwait wasn't an invasion. It was reunification. But Saddam wasn't stupid. He knew invading Kuwait could trigger a response from the international community, especially the United States. So before he made any move, he needed to test the waters. He needed to know where America stood. And that's where things get really interesting. On July 25, 1990, just 8 days before the invasion, Saddam Hussein met with the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie. This meeting is one of the most controversial moments in modern history, because what was said in that room may have given Saddam the green light to invade Kuwait. According to the transcript that was later released, Saddam told Glaspie about his problems with Kuwait, the debt, the oil overproduction, the slant drilling. He made it clear he was considering military action. And Glaspie's response? She said the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, like the border disagreement between Iraq and Kuwait. Read that again, no opinion. Now, to be fair, Glaspie also said that the U.S. wanted the issue resolved peacefully. But Saddam didn't hear that part, or he chose not to. What he heard was that America wouldn't interfere, that this was an internal Arab issue, that he had the freedom to handle Kuwait however he wanted. Some historians argue that Glaspie's statement was deliberately vague, that the U.S. wanted Saddam to think he had a free pass so they could justify a military response later. Others say it was just poor diplomacy, a miscommunication, but either way, the result was the same. Saddam thought he was safe. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces stormed into Kuwait. The invasion was swift and brutal. Within hours, Iraqi tanks were in Kuwait City. The Kuwaiti military barely put up a fight. The royal family fled to Saudi Arabia. And by the next day, Saddam declared Kuwait the 19th province of Iraq. The world was stunned, but Saddam wasn't worried. He thought the worst he'd face was some diplomatic pressure, maybe sanctions. He thought the Arab world would stay quiet. He thought the U.S. wouldn't care enough to act. He was wrong. The international response was immediate and fierce. The United Nations Security Council condemned the invasion. They demanded Iraq withdraw immediately. When Saddam refused, the UN imposed sanctions, trade embargoes, asset freezes. Iraq was cut off from the global economy. But sanctions weren't enough, because this wasn't just about Kuwait. It was about oil, about power, about setting a precedent. If Saddam could invade a neighbor and get away with it, what would stop him from going further? Saudi Arabia was right next door. And if Iraq controlled both Kuwaiti and Saudi oil fields, Saddam would control nearly half of the world's oil supply. That was unacceptable, especially to the United States. President George H.W. Bush immediately began building a coalition. He rallied support from Europe, the Arab world, and even the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest military alliances ever formed. 35 countries joined the coalition, and they all had one goal: get Iraq out of Kuwait. But Bush didn't just want to push Iraq out. He wanted to send a message. He called Saddam's invasion the worst act of aggression since World War II. He compared him to Hitler. He said this was about defending freedom, protecting smaller nations, and upholding international law. And the American people believed him. Support for military action was high. The media showed images of Kuwaiti refugees, stories of Iraqi soldiers committing atrocities. Some of those stories were true, some were exaggerated. Some were completely made up, but they worked. Public opinion was firmly on the side of intervention. Meanwhile, Saddam tried to negotiate. He offered to withdraw from Kuwait if Israel withdrew from Palestinian territories. He tried to frame the conflict as part of a larger struggle for Arab dignity, but nobody was buying it. The coalition wasn't interested in deals. They wanted unconditional withdrawal. Saddam refused, and so the world prepared for war. Throughout the fall of 1990, coalition forces poured into Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Shield, they called it. Hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, aircraft, warships. It was the largest military buildup since Vietnam, and it all happened in a matter of months. The U.S. military used this time to prepare. They studied Iraqi defenses. They planned their strategy, and they waited for the deadline. The UN had given Saddam until January 15, 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait. If he didn't, the coalition would use force. Saddam still didn't believe they'd actually do it. He thought it was all a bluff. He thought the U.S. didn't have the stomach for a ground war. He remembered Vietnam. He thought Americans were afraid of casualties, that they'd back down at the last second. But January 15th came and went. Saddam didn't withdraw. And on January 17, 1991, the war began. Operation Desert Storm started with an air campaign like the world had never seen. Coalition aircraft launched wave after wave of strikes against Iraqi targets, military bases, command centers, communication networks, infrastructure. The bombing was relentless. Iraq's air defenses were overwhelmed within hours. Their air force was grounded. Their military command was in chaos. For 38 days, the coalition pounded Iraq from the air. They dropped more bombs in the first day than were dropped in the entire Vietnam War. Iraq had no answer. Their technology was outdated. Their tactics were ineffective, and their leadership was in disarray. Saddam tried to fight back. He launched Scud missiles at Israel, hoping to draw them into the war and fracture the coalition. Arab countries in the alliance wouldn't want to fight alongside Israel, but the U.S. convinced Israel to stay out. They deployed Patriot missile systems to intercept the Scuds. The plan failed. Then came the ground war. On February 24th, coalition forces launched a massive ground offensive. They didn't attack head-on into Kuwait like Iraq expected. Instead, they swung west into the desert and attacked from the side. It was a flanking maneuver on a massive scale, and it worked perfectly. Iraqi forces were caught completely off guard. They were surrounded, cut off. Within 100 hours, the coalition had liberated Kuwait and destroyed most of Iraq's military. Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Some set fire to Kuwaiti oil fields as they retreated, creating an environmental disaster. Black smoke filled the sky for months. By February 28th, it was over. President Bush declared a ceasefire. Kuwait was free. Iraq was defeated, and Saddam was still in power. So how did the Gulf War really start? It started with debt, with oil, with pride, and with a conversation that should never have happened the way it did. Saddam Hussein believed he had permission to take Kuwait. He thought the world would look the other way, and when he realized his mistake, it was too late. The war lasted just over 6 weeks, but its consequences lasted decades. Iraq was left broken and bitter. Sanctions remained in place for years. Saddam stayed in power, more paranoid and isolated than ever, and the U.S. kept troops in the region, setting the stage for everything that came after: the War on Terror, the 2003 invasion, the rise of extremism. The Gulf War wasn't just about Kuwait. It was about control. It was about power. And it was about what happens when nations play games with other nations' futures. Saddam thought he was making a strategic move, but he was just a piece on someone else's board. And that's how the Gulf War really started. Subscribe for more stories the history books won't tell you.